All right, well, thank you very much for a great introduction there. And I'd like to thank Indian and all the people here at the Mesa Music Festival for asking me to share my photos today. And thanks to all of you for coming out. I prepared a talk for you, and I hope you like it. Now, I am Bob Gruen, and I live in New York City, and I've been working as a rock and roll photographer since 1965. And I didn't just visit this lifestyle as a journalist. I live it, and I enjoy it. I've worked with a lot of powerful artists who have inspired the world, and I've helped to promote their image. It's important for me to capture the passion and the feeling of what's going on, and my path has been through rock and roll. Now, I was in my early teens when popular music started getting faster and louder, and news reports warned of the danger of this new sound, this rock and roll. It seems it was stirring up passionate feelings in people, and the authorities were very afraid of that because it couldn't be controlled. Now, there's often a feeling of anarchy when thousands of people are gathered, each free and expressing themselves in their own way, with 4 or 5 musicians at the center. Nothing compares to the chaotic excitement you get in the middle of a live, loud show. And I think my work is about freedom, not just pop celebrity portraits. Rock and roll for me has always been about the freedom to express your feelings very loudly in public. It's about that moment when hundreds or thousands of people all yell yay at the same time, and they aren't thinking about anything else. They're just feeling fully alive. Now, some people like to have music playing in the background when they work, but I like it in the foreground. Now, I enjoy being from New York, and I used to wear a New York City t-shirt like this all the time. I got several of them whenever I'd see the guys who sold them on the sidewalk in Times Square. And I used to give them to my friends, and I gave one to John Lennon. I cut the sleeves off myself with a buck knife to give it more of a New York feel. Now, I'm most well known for this photo, taken on the rooftop terrace of John Lennon's New York apartment in 1974. John had asked me to take photos for his new album, The Walls and Bridges, in a quick and simple way so he didn't have to interrupt his recording schedule. He wanted different photos of his face so you could make up different expressions by flipping the cutout strips. I put some white paper on a wall of his penthouse terrace, and I did a series of shots. Then we took a few more pictures to use for publicity, and after I suggested that the shirt I had given him a year earlier would be perfect with the skyline all around us, he went and put it on, and we took the shots. We had no idea it was going to become as well known as it has. But I'll explain how I got to do this. I grew up just outside New York City. My mom and dad were lawyers who taught me to question everything. I learned that no is not an answer to accept, but it can be the beginning of an interesting conversation. My dad said it's easier to ask for forgiveness than permission. And photography was my mom's hobby, and she showed me how to develop and print my own photos. I took an immediate liking to photography, and when I was 8 years old, my parents gave me my first camera, a Kodak Brownie Hawkeye. And one of my earliest memories was when I was 5 years old in summer camp, and I refused to get out of bed to go to the early morning flag raising because I didn't want to. I said it's a free country, and I can do what I want. And I felt like that all my life, and I still don't like to get up early. And at 13, I attended my first concert at my local high school. Folk singer Pete Seeger sang of peace and love and freedom for all, and he encouraged the audience to sing along with them. I remember it being one of the most thought-provoking and fun experiences I ever had. He was singing about all the things I had been taught were morally right, but the very next week, the local newspapers had letters fiercely attacking him as an anti-American communist and condemning the school system for allowing him to perform. I was shocked because this concert was the most positive message I ever heard, and it became my favorite kind of music, music with a message. Now, I like to take pictures of dramatic events. This was my first published photo, which made the cover of our local newspaper. I was coming home from high school at the time, and I ran up to an adjoining rooftop to catch this shot of a fire. And I took photos for the school newspapers of football and other school events, and when I went to my high school prom, I took my camera. Now, I went to several colleges, including Southern Illinois University in Carbondale, Illinois, where I again worked for the school's daily newspaper. And I took this picture the only way out of town, which was where I wanted to go. A sociology teacher at the Baltimore Community College told me I belonged in Greenwich Village, and I soon found out he was right, and I've been living there ever since. I was listening to Bob Dylan, Tom Paxton, Phil Oakes, and the other rabble-rousers of the folk movement, and I talked somebody into giving me my first photo pass at the Newport Folk Festival in 1965, when Bob Dylan famously played with an electric rock band. To me, it was a declaration that rock and roll was the folk music of America. It said that people booed, but actually it was not as simple as that, as there were as many people cheering as booing, many just yelling at each other in the seats. These people are really afraid of any kind of change, of anything being different. The musicians I like sing about social politics, not just lust and desire like most pop music. Now, Bob Dylan's been a big influence in my life. In the 60s, when I was trying to explain to my mom how I felt, I played Bob Dylan's "It's All Right, Ma, I'm Only Bleeding." I'm not sure she got it, but I did. For me, I like Bob Dylan because every time I hear a song, I have different thoughts. And for me, the meaning is just what it makes you think about. There's really nothing to figure out. I'm a huge fan, but I never really had a chance to talk to him. The one time he spoke to me was after I sneaked my cameras into a few of his Rolling Thunder tour shows, where I took this photo. He wasn't allowing any photography, but I was driven to cover it as a news story. I happened to meet him a couple of months later on the street, and he told me he wanted to beat me up. He was angry that I had taken photos without permission and published them. For me, it was like meeting God and finding out that he wanted to kill me. Now, speaking of Bob, a funny thing happened when I photographed George Harrison at the Madison Square Garden. And I went to the after party at the Plaza Hotel with his agent and his drummer, both good friends of mine. As we walked in, my friends went towards the bar, and I stood, looking around the room. And George came in, and he saw the room full of people, and he said, "Who are all these people?" And turned to me and said, "Who are you?" I said, "I'm Bob Gruen." He said, "You're not Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan's a friend of mine. Throw him out." And before I could say another word, I was out in the hall. But back to my beginnings. I had a number of jobs before I was able to pay my rent as a photographer. One Christmas, I was Santa Claus. And at the New York World's Fair, I got a job baking Belgian waffles. I took photos of babies, and I took photos of paintings in museums. I was really bad with the babies, and the art photography was really boring, but I did learn a lot about how color film works by trying to reproduce the colors in the paintings. Now, my parents always wanted me to get a real job. They felt photography was a good hobby, but not a good career. Now, in those days, there was a theory about people that they should turn on, tune in, and drop out, and I did. Little did I know that by dropping out would actually be my road to success. By the late 60s, I knew I wasn't cut out for a 9-to-5 job because I just couldn't make the 9 o'clock part. Now, this is a picture I took in the middle of the night with a full moon. It was a long exposure, and I sat on it for a short while, and then I moved out of the frame as the exposure continued, so you can see right through me. I keep in mind the idea that we're all spirits, and we're all just passing through here. Anyway, I had to be independent and work for myself. In the late 60s, I was living with a rock band, first known as the Justice League, and later as the Glitter House. They were discovered by the renowned producer, Bob Crew, who had them sing vocals on the Barbarella soundtrack. And then he got a record contract. The record company used my photos for publicity and started to hire me to photograph other groups. I took a photo class at Fashion Institute in New York, where I learned some basic studio techniques, and I made this high-contrast photo, which I used for my business card then. My photo influences include Man Ray for making art with photography, Henry Cartier-Bresson for always catching the decisive moment, and Arthur Felleg, known as Ouija, who was always in the right place at the right time. Now, one night I went with some friends who said we must see Ike and Tina Turner, and I took some pictures. The place was called the Honka Monka Room. You can't make that up. At the end of the show, as the strobe light was flashing, I set my camera for a 1-second exposure, and I took several shots. And this one came out just right, and I think it's one of my best. A few days later, I took the pictures with me to show my friends when we went to another Ike and Tina show. As I was showing them the photos, Ike walked by, and one of my friends literally pushed me in front of Ike and said, "Show Ike the photos." He liked them a lot, and he told me to come to more shows, and soon I started to travel with them. I had one of the very first portable video recorders, the Sony Portapack, and I taped many shows for Ike and Tina. You had to thread the tape from one reel to another. It was black and white with mono sound, but it was state of the art in those days. Tina liked that they could see the playback immediately after the show in the dressing room or in the hotel room, and she and the Ikeettes would improve their review. I've edited the videos into a DVD called Ike and Tina on the Road, 1971-72. My first album cover was for Ike and Tina in 1971, and this led to many more introductions and new contacts. Now, I had been using my dad's Minolta, but I finally got a good Nikon camera. The first night I had it, I went to Madison Square Garden to photograph a rock and roll revival show. I was standing on a seat trying to get a shot of Chuck Berry kissing his guitar when a guard started yelling at me to get off the seat. He literally lifted me up, but before he dropped me in the aisle, I got this shot from just the right angle. Now, in 1972, I was included in the first book of rock photos called The Photography of Rock. The writer for the book asked me to come with him when he interviewed John Lennon and Yoko Ono for a story about their backup band, The Elephant's Memory. The interview was at a hotel, and when we met there, he told me that John and Yoko had just woken up, and they weren't expecting a photographer. He said they were a little cranky, but don't worry, they'll wake up some more, they'll feel better, they'll let you come up, and they'll let you take photos of them, and they'll like your photos, and they'll probably like you, and you'll probably become friends because that's the way they are. I remember him saying that because that's exactly what happened. I said, I'll be in the bar, and let me know when you're ready. 20 minutes later, as I was walking down the hall to meet them, I realized I was shaking from being so nervous. I knew I wouldn't be able to take photos shaking like that, so I stopped, and I took a deep breath, and I said to myself that it would only be all right if I relaxed and I was myself. So I went in with some confidence, and I got this shot of them. And since we were working on a story about the Elephant's Memory Band, I asked if I could come along to the recording studio that night and get photos with them and the band, and they said okay. At the end of the night, I took this photo of all of them together. And several weeks later, they contacted me and asked if they could use it in the artwork for their Sometime in New York City album. And after that, I started to visit their studio more often and work with them. They're the kind of artists I admire, encouraging people to think about peace and love. And like Pete Seeger and Bob Dylan, they were constantly being attacked for their views. Now, the first rock concert I saw was the Rolling Stones at the Academy of Music in 1965. It was the most exciting show I ever experienced. I was an immediate fan, and I have been ever since. When I first met Lisa Robinson, she was a music columnist for the New York Post, and she was syndicated in hundreds of other newspapers. She's also the editor of Rock Scene magazine. Lisa's a very important person in the music business, and I'm very thankful for the many photo passes she arranged for me in my career. It was Lisa who got me my first photo pass to the Rolling Stones at Madison Square Garden in 1972. For me, they have always been the image of rock and roll. Now, I worked with a lot of groups that were considered dangerous. The New York Dolls frightened people because they pushed the accepted boundaries. They dolled themselves up, not as transvestites, but as beautiful men looking for a kiss. They dressed like dolls because girls like to play with dolls. When asked if they were bisexual, the lead singer, David Johansen, answered, "No, we're trisexual. We'll try anything." In fact, they were the most macho gang of guys I've hung out with, and they attracted more groupies than any of the others. I started traveling with them, and I shot their second album cover. I also made a lot of videos with them that have been released as DVDs titled All Dolled Up and Looking Fine on Television. And I met the Dolls and also Aerosmith because they both shared the same management as the Elephant's Memory. And they hired me to photograph Aerosmith in Boston when they were just starting to become popular, and I'm still friends with them today. Now, as an independent, freelance person, you answer only to yourself, but you wake up every day unemployed. You can choose what you want to do, though often the pressure of life's expenses cause you to take on jobs solely for the money, like these. But that's a choice, too. I got work from a lot of record companies doing trade shots and publicity photos for hundreds of bands. This was my rent money. I photographed a lot of different events, groups big and small, day and night. Usually I was paid just $75 or $100 per job, sometimes a little more. The early album cover jobs paid only $300. And rock magazines like Cream or The NME would only pay $25 or $35 a photo. So photo processing and travel costs were very high, so I had to work a lot to pay my bills. But a lot of groups I did for fun, for free, new groups that didn't have any money. And my outlet for this was Rock Scene magazine. Rock Scene was something we all did for free, like a fanzine. It was distributed by a publisher who made mostly comic books, so you'd find it in candy stores rather than in newsstands. And for Rock Scene, we did photo stories about the whole rock lifestyle. And we didn't limit our stories to groups that were known, but covered anybody that we found interesting. The pages of Rock Scene were alive with photos of touring and backstage parties. We were underground, outside the system, with funky distribution, but we inspired people, many of whom have since come up to me and said that after reading Rock Scene, they left home and moved to New York because we made it look like so much fun. And that always makes me feel good. You can see Rock Scene today online at www.rockscenestir, S-T-E-R, rockscenestir.com. Now, living the life rock style, I became friends with many of the musicians I met, and I could take photos of them in casual settings. A lot of the bands I worked with were not famous when I met them, and I was able to record their early moments. I got to know the Ramones when they couldn't even afford guitar cases, and Dee Dee couldn't even afford a shopping bag, which is ironic since he wrote most of the songs, and in the end, he was the richest Ramone. Now, I worked with many big-name bands, too. Lisa Robinson called me one day to say that we were going to Pittsburgh with Led Zeppelin. I asked how we would get there, and she said they had their own tour plane. When we got to the airport, Robert Plant asked me to take a picture of the band with the plane. This photo is on the first roll of film I took of them, but it's one of the most well-known pictures of Led Zeppelin. It really sums up the excess of the rock lifestyle of the 70s. Now, I relate to things visually. For me, if this is show business, there should be a show to see. Now, Alice Cooper always acts out each song in a highly dramatic way, and he's really great fun to see. When Salvador Dali wanted to make a hologram of the brain of the pop star, he chose to use Alice as his model. He felt Alice was a surrealist like himself. Now, this definitely was one of the most interesting photo sessions I ever had. Dali was carrying on about the art of Confucianism, that nothing is ever really understood. And Alice was wearing $2 million worth of real diamonds, protected by a large thug with a machine gun. It was a funny afternoon. The holograms are now in the Dali museums in Florida and Spain, where you can buy a postcard of this picture. Now, a lot of bands I worked with were very wild. One time, my dad bragged to a friend of his that I was in Japan working with the rock band Kiss. Instead of being impressed, however, his friend was shocked and told him that Kiss advocated wanton sex, drugs, and rock and roll, meaning all that was wrong, and that they were a threat to society. When my dad asked me if this was true, I didn't know what to say. Personally, I thought, I like sex and rock and roll, and I don't think that's a threat to society. Now, I don't advocate drug use, and neither does Kiss for that matter, but I think there should be room for fun in a free world. Now, I had my first photo exhibit in 1974 at the Art Barn in Greenwich, Connecticut. Photography was only just beginning to be considered an art form, but it's grown in popularity and value. And I always wanted to sell my pictures as art and not just published as news. My motto has always been artis gratia pecuniae, which means, if I pronounce it right, art for the sake of money. A creative person wants to make art, but you have to pay your rent. Now, the President of the United States, Richard Nixon, wanted John Lennon deported. And what was his crime? He dared to speak of peace in a time of war. Now, I believed in the ideas of John and Yoko, and one of the main reasons I wanted to help them was that I felt their message of peace and love was so important. I suggested taking a photo of John in front of the Statue of Liberty to dramatize his case, the statue being the symbol of welcome to the country whose government was trying to throw him out. I was thrilled that John agreed with me to take the picture, but I was surprised that many news outlets, not many, would publish it, being afraid to be involved with John's political case. After he died in 1980, the picture became much more popular. And I think this is because people relate to John Lennon as a symbol of personal freedom, similar to the Statue of Liberty. Now, people think I'm lucky because I work with so many famous artists and bands, but I work with thousands of bands that didn't make it. The luck was that a few of them did become popular and successful, like Debbie Harry here. And there's always been a bit of luck of timing in my life. I seem to be at the right place at the right time pretty often. And one bit of luck in my life came when I told my brother I needed a car, but I only had a little bit of money. He found this 1954 Buick for me for only $300, and I had a real rock and roll car. But mostly I got around town first on a bicycle and later on this moped because it was faster, and I always had to make deadlines. Now, there's a fear factor involved with being a free agent, and while I like to think I'm not afraid of anything, personally, I worry about everything. I worry about getting out of bed in the morning. I worry about standing up because I might fall down. I worry about every decision I have to make. But I don't let it stop me. I live in fear, but I'm not scared. Fear is the energy that keeps me going. Winston Churchill said that when you're going through hell, keep going. I crave peace and quiet, but I thrive in chaos. In 1975, John Lennon took time off to be with his son, Sean. When Sean was only 1 month old, John called and asked me to come over to take photos to send to his family. He seemed happier than I had ever seen him, and he stayed away from public life for the next 5 years. Now, I was hired to photograph the Bay City Rollers, who were hugely popular with young, screaming teenage girls. I made more money with the Rollers than with any other group I've worked with. My magazines would buy one Blondie shot, maybe 2 Rolling Stones pictures, and 45 Bay City Roller photos to make a whole magazine issue just about them. When the Rollers came to New York, they wanted to meet John Lennon. I asked John, and he said if they were still together in a group in 5 years, he'd meet them then. They weren't. So I asked him if he could give them any advice, and he said, well, tell them to get all the money now in their own names, which was very good advice, and they should have taken it, since in the end they never did get what was due to them. Now, this is me in my studio in 1977. I found the BG letters on the street outside the Fillmore East Theater when it closed. For me, since the letters are from the Fillmore, they stand not only for Bob Gruen, but for Bill Graham, the greatest rock show promoter who founded the Fillmore Theaters and was the first to develop arena rock shows. On the wall of his office, he had an engraved plaque with the motto, "Don't give the audience what they want, give them what they should want." Now, the Sex Pistols caused a real commotion when they used a common curse word on TV, and they were widely condemned for it. They were just a rock and roll band, but people made such a big deal about it. I met their creator, Malcolm McLaren, in New York when he came to work with the New York Dolls. In 1976, when I went to England for the first time, his was the only phone number I had. He took me to a place called Club Louise, where I met many of the people who became the punk scene in England. He encouraged me to photograph the Sex Pistols, who seemed obnoxious at first, but in fact, they're nice guys once you get to know them. And it was there that I also met Joe Strummer and Mick Jones of The Clash. And I went to see them at one of their first shows in London. I was very impressed with the raging power of their performance. I sought them out and worked with them because they had a profound commitment to work for a better world. They encouraged people to know your rights, and they began one song with the phrase, "What are you going to do now?" You know, I went on 2 tours across America with The Clash, and they say the Sex Pistols made people want to scream with rage, but The Clash gave people the reasons. The Sex Pistols looked back with anger, while The Clash looked ahead to the future with hope. Now, I prefer people who are seeking solutions rather than just complaining about problems. John Lennon said there are no problems, only solutions. Now, I also went across America with the Sex Pistols on their tour bus. And while the shows were pure mayhem, it was actually pretty mellow on the bus, mostly beer and reggae music. But when the door opened, all hell broke loose. They were young, they were arrogant, very free, saying whatever they felt like. And many people were insulted by their attitude and their rude behavior. But I must say they did have some idea of what they were doing. One day when Sid and I were having a hot dog at soundcheck, I picked up my camera to take a photo, and Sid said, "Wait." And then he put more mustard and ketchup on his hot dog, and he smeared it on his face to match his button. He was a mess, but he knew how to express it. Now, this photo is now in the permanent collection of the National Portrait Gallery in London. It was chosen by David Bowie to represent one of the great personalities of the 20th century. Can't make that up. In the summer of 1980, John and Yoko were back in the studio making a new album, and they asked me to come to photograph them. I often stopped by while they were mixing their Double Fantasy album. And this photo was taken in the Hit Factory studio on both John and Sean's birthday, October 9th. It looks like John is showing Sean the wonder of the recording world, but he's really showing me the new computerized control panel that will mix the playback and move the volume controls all by themselves. Now, in December, I took some more photos at the studio. I'd taken a few of John and Yoko standing in front of the big guitar there in the record plant studio, when John pushed Yoko against the wall and said, "Take one like this. This is what everyone wants to see." John was very happy that their album was selling well and moving up the charts, and he was planning a world tour, but a few days later, he was shot. And this was the biggest loss I ever experienced, and it's not something that you can ever get over, although eventually you get used to it and you go on. Well, Tina Turner got over her breakup with Ike, and she started a solo career. In 1982, she had a big comeback show at the Ritz in New York, and David Bowie and Keith Richards were there to cheer her on. And it was great to see her doing so well on her own. Now, many people consider The Clash the only band that really mattered, myself included. And after they broke up in the early 80s, I wasn't as interested in touring with bands anymore. With the advent of MTV and the music business becoming so corporate, bands started controlling their image more, and it was harder to gain access to photograph them and to hold on to the rights to license the photos. So I started to work more on books and exhibitions of my work. In 1982, I had a big exhibition with a party at Studio 54, and in 1985, I published Listen to These Pictures, my first book of photos of John Lennon. At another exhibition of my work, Yoko Ono came with her son Sean and my friend Keith Haring. He was a very cool guy, and his art is as full of the energy of life as he was. Keith made a drawing of me, which I've used on my business card ever since. And in the 80s, they started the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And every year has been an induction dinner, which I enjoy going to. In 1988, I get this photo of Bruce Springsteen, Bob Dylan, and Mick Jagger in the after-show jam. And in 1988, a Japanese publisher released a book of my Rolling Stones pictures called The Rolling Stones, featuring Keith Richards. They were starting to think more about Keith than Mick as the real force behind the Stones. They put the photo of Keith with Tina on the cover, and it was released just as Keith released his first solo album. So my timing was good, and he was happy to be featured on the cover of the book. He hired me to shoot several of his shows and his press party where this photo was taken. Now, during his solo show, I saw a spiritual side of Keith I hadn't been aware of before, and he seemed to be coming into his own as a musician. Now, I felt I had to be there for the Sex Pistols reunion concert at Finsbury Park in London in '96. More people were there than had ever seen them in all the shows they had played when they started out. And they were great. They play Sex Pistols songs better than anybody. But Iggy Pop opened the show, and he's a tough act to follow, Iggy being one of the most intense performers in rock and roll. He's an animal on stage, but backstage he's just charming, as you can see by the way Kate Moss is looking at him, and the wary look Johnny Depp's eyes, none too happy about the way his girlfriend was looking at Iggy. And now Joe Strummer and I had become very good friends, and in the 80s he stayed with me, sleeping on my couch when he was in New York. I had a great time hanging out with him in the late 90s, going to shows of his new band, the Mescaleros. My wife Elizabeth and I would have to remember to bring our sunglasses when we went out to dinner with Joe, because we'd always be up all night, and when you walk out of a bar at 8 o'clock in the morning, you need your sunglasses. Now, the last time he was in town, we ended up the night dancing on tables at a downtown restaurant. He died of a heart attack a month later, and he was a powerful spirit and the voice of his generation. Now, when the Rolling Stones announced their tour in the spring of 2002, I shot the event with film as usual, but also with a newly available higher quality Canon digital camera. I took the memory card back to my agency, and I dropped the film at the lab to be developed. By the time I got home 20 minutes later, my photos were on the agency website and were being seen around the world. I almost forgot to pick up the slides the next day because the job was done, as the scheduled scans were already out there already being licensed. A few months later, I had a photo session with Ryan Adams. We'd been planning it for a while, but kept putting it off until the night before a deadline to get a shot of him at a recording studio for Rolling Stone magazine. My friends at the Electric Ladies studio let me use the place, and we shot a lot of digital photos. And then we went back to my studio and took some more photos and then looked at them all on my computer. Ryan picked out what he liked, and before he was in the cab going home, the photos had been sent over the internet to Rolling Stone, and the job was done. And I've been using Canon digital cameras ever since. Now, one day I was talking to Liv Tyler and telling her about the Iggy Pop show I was going to that night, when she told me she had never seen him, and she was planning on having dinner with her dad, Steven Tyler. When she told me he hadn't ever seen Iggy either, I insisted that she had to bring them to see the greatest rock performer around today, and that night I got this shot of all of them together. Now, I met the Strokes several times in New York, and one night I got a photo of the singer, Julian Casablancas, with Jack White of the White Stripes. I like the White Stripes and their minimal style, and Jack's career has exploded since then. And I recently visited his Third Man Records compound in Nashville. He's got all kinds of things, the recording studio and performance studio, and now he's recently added a new lab to develop and print photos from film. Now, Yoko returned to the art career she had before she met John Lennon, and I was lucky to be in Paris when she performed her Cut piece for the first time since the 60s. She sits alone on a stage as people from the audience are invited to come up and cut off a piece of her clothing. It shows how vulnerable she's willing to be to make her message of communication and trust. We must learn to trust if we hope to have peace in the world, and it's not easy. One of my favorite groups is Green Day. I was happy when their album American Idiot became such a worldwide success and was also adapted as a Broadway musical. Their songs are about the same kind of ideas, raging against the system's lack of opportunity and hypocrisy and the lack of freedom that the punks have been royally attacked for. But here's Green Day receiving all kinds of awards for the same sentiments, and I think that's great progress. There seems to be a thread of social commentary coming from folk music through rock and roll that continues today. Now, when people tell me I must have led a very exciting life, I tell them yes, and I still do. If you want to live an exciting life, you just have to get out of your house and do it. I still go out all the time and see shows, and I take pictures that I post on my website, www.bobgruen.com. And I still like to see a show that inspires people to get up and shout. This photo of Courtney Love shows that she wasn't about to stop just because she spent the previous night in jail. Now, one of my funnier photo shoots was with a band called Lordi from Finland, and they won the Eurovision contest, the best of 45 countries, but they're not very well known in the US. I took them to the middle of Times Square, and we didn't even get a sidelong glance from the cops. See, I have to be a lot more than weird to get attention in New York. Now, 37 years ago, I took a photo of the Clash on the roof of the RCA building, where you're on the top of New York City. When I heard that Green Day was going to be taping a TV show in the same building, I suggested we could go up on the roof and take a photo in the same place as their favorite group, and they agreed. The roof had been closed to the public for many years, but it's open again now, and for me, it was a great homecoming to the old spot. Now, I still go to shows all the time and take photos, mostly using a pocket camera, like this shot of Lady Gaga at Madison Square Garden. And one of my favorite new bands is the Stripes, a young group from Ireland that really captures the feeling of early rock and roll, like the young Rolling Stones, Yardbirds, or Animals, but with their own unique style. In August this year, the Hysteric Glamour fashion company brought me to London to take photos of the Stripes wearing their new fall line, and they looked great. Although I usually work alone, for this job there was a crew of 15 people, which included stylists and makeup and lighting, etc., and I was in charge of the whole thing all day. Now, another favorite band of mine is The Kills. I go see them whenever I can. This photo is from a big rock festival in Brittany 2 years ago. And I've become friends with the Barbed Wire Dolls, a very loud punk band and really good people who are from Crete in Greece. And we had a fantastic time going there and visiting them. Now, last week I met with the editor and art director for my current book project, Green Day. I've been a fan and a friend for 25 years now. I like their positive message and their very powerful show. And after 25 years, it's time to put the photos in a book. Now, people used to say that rock and roll is for kids, but I find that as people who play rock get older, they usually get better. And even though the original fans are older, they keep coming to the shows, along with all their new young fans. Now, in 2007, a grand exhibition of my work titled Rockers was presented in Brazil at the FAPE University Museum in Sao Paulo. My Brazilian rock star friend Supla was the curator who helped me pick out the 280 photos on display. It was really amazing, attracting over 40,000 visitors, and I hope it inspired some people to follow their dreams. Now, for the exhibition, I created an installation called Teenage Bedroom, which I've been showing in my exhibits ever since. It's based on the way teenagers cover their bedroom walls with pictures of their favorite rock heroes. It's made up of posters, magazine covers, and stories with my photos. This is the one we did for the Orphic Gallery in Rosendale, New York. Now, I tried to set up one in all my exhibits, and it was included in an exhibition in New York's Museum of Modern Art. The exhibit was called Looking at Music, and it showed how media and music interacted in New York in the 70s. Now, if somebody had told me 40 years ago when I was starting out that my work would end up in MoMA, I never would have believed it. But now rock and roll is part of the art of our culture. And several years ago, the Grammy Award-winning director Don Letts made a documentary about me called Rock and Roll Exposed. It features Iggy Pop, Alice Cooper, Debbie Harry, Yoko Ono, Billie Joe Armstrong, and others talking not only about me, but about how important images are to rock and roll and how they inspire people. It's been shown around the world on cable TV, and it's such a good soundtrack that I can't afford to license it as a DVD. But it's available from time to time online. And Rock Scene, a monograph of my work with more than 500 photos, was published by Abrams Image in 2011. It's so popular that now it's in its 5th printing, and it's very unusual for a photo book. Now, a few years ago, Abrams published a revised 10th anniversary edition of my 2005 John Lennon New York Years book, with a new cover and 16 pages of previously unseen photos. And a revised edition of my Clash book of photos was released with a signed print. And a book I originally made as a birthday present for Yoko Ono was published as See Here Yoko. Recently, I've had exhibitions in Argentina and Japan. And next month, I'll have a John Lennon photo exhibition in Seoul, South Korea, and another exhibition in Havana in December as well. Now, this past August, I was in Japan for the Fuji Rock Festival. More than 125,000 people attended, most camping out, and it's one of the best run and most interesting of all the festivals I've been to. The promoters of the festival have published my Rock Scene book, and they flew me there to promote it. Now, in September of this year, the United States Postal Service issued an official John Lennon stamp featuring my photo of John. There was a ceremony in Central Park with radio DJ Dennis Elsas, Postmaster General Megan Brennan, Sean Lennon, Yoko Ono, and me. You can see a video of the ceremony at USPS Facebook page or my Facebook page. Now, thank you for having me here today. And check out my website, bobgruen.com, for updates on where I've been and what I'm doing. And now I'll be happy to answer as many questions as we have time for, so I get to tell you something you'd actually want to know. So, thank you. Best Zeppelin story? I didn't actually travel with Zeppelin. Well, it's all true. The stories of them riding motorcycles in the Continental Riot House in California. I've stayed in that hotel, but actually the Zeppelin story, I stayed at the Continental Riot House. I was there to photograph Susie Quattro, who was opening for Alice Cooper. But I got to my room in the Continental Hyatt House, and apparently John Bonham had just left that room. Because I walked in, I put my suitcase down, and the telephone rang. And I picked it up, and somebody said, "Hey, tell John I got the stuff." And I said, "John's not here. What are you talking about?" I hang up. Phone rang 30 seconds later. "Hey, it's John. I got what he asked for." I said, "Hey, John's not here. Forget about it." I hang up. Phone rang another 30 seconds later. "Hey, I got what John wanted. Tell him, put him on the phone. I got what he wanted." And I hung up the phone again. And I went down to the desk, and I said, "Listen, this is not my room. I got to change rooms." So actually, I wasn't there when John was there, but I have an idea what was going on. Any other questions? Yes? My pocket camera? Well, I've been using Canon, but I just got this new Lumina, which has a much longer zoom lens. I had a problem with pocket cameras because for a long time you could either get a long zoom lens, but you wouldn't get what's called a RAW file, which is a very large kind of professional file. You can make much bigger pictures from it. Or you could get a camera with a RAW file, but then you'll be only 2 or 3 times in the zoom. And I finally found this Lumina. It's a Panasonic camera that has a 10x zoom and a RAW file. And now I've just heard that Sony put one out, and I can't believe they have like a 750 millimeter lens or something. It's like unbelievable. It's like twice the size, the zoom of my little pocket camera. But I actually used the Lumina when I went to England about a year ago. I went for a Green Day concert, and I got there, I just took my camera bag as usual, and I usually use a long lens, a 35 to 350, a Canon lens that I call my everything lens. It's from wide angle to very close up. You can get just a headshot from far away. And I opened my camera bag, and I had forgotten the lens. But luckily, I had the pocket camera, which had a 10x zoom, and that worked. And some of those pictures are going to be in my book. So, it's not the camera, it's what you do with it. Yes? What? Did Bob Dylan forgive me? I don't know. I've never seen him since. We've never spoken. I was actually in a dressing room, what was it, maybe 20 years later in Japan. I was there with Sheena from Sheena and the Rockets, who's kind of like a Tina Turner of Japan, and Joey Ramone. I happened to be in Japan when they were there, and I got Joey and Sheena into the concert. And I know the bass player, Tony Garnier, so he had us come backstage. And Bob Dylan usually doesn't even come in the dressing room. He kind of walks by and glances and keeps going. But he came in that day, looked at me, looked at Sheena, and just kind of, glazing right past us. And then he saw Joey. He said, "Hey, Joey, how are you doing?" and Joey gave him his new CD. But no, he didn't talk to me, so I never knew. I almost met him. I don't know if I almost met him. I went backstage at the Fuji Festival this summer. He was the headliner at the Fuji Festival. And I was with the promoter who went back to say hello to him. And the road manager wouldn't let us go back to say hello. He said, "Bob's busy." So we didn't get to see him. And I was really nervous. I had no idea if he'd remember me from 40 years ago or if he had heard about me. He might even think my pictures are good nowadays. I don't know. He might have heard of me. But I was very nervous. I didn't know if he'd remember and say, "Oh, it's you." So it didn't happen anyway, so I didn't find out. Well, that was early on. You're asking about the Allman Brothers. I was assigned by Cream Magazine to go to Macon, Georgia, and do a story about Macon, and it was really a very interesting trip for me. visiting the studios and just the southern town. And I actually took a lot of pictures of the whole town. And then we went on tour for 2 days with the Allman Brothers, and that's when I first met them. We got there actually kind of late. I think we missed the first plane. We got there just as they were going on. And after the concert, it was kind of a wild night in Florida. It was warm. There was a pool in the motel. I remember some girls jumping in the pool naked. It was kind of like that scene that they see in the Almost Famous movie. And the next morning, I left the motel with them, and I got on the bus. The road manager knew I was supposed to be there, and everybody was very hungover, and I was sitting on the bus, and the band gets on, and they all sit down, and we start driving away. And then they kind of looked, and they see this fuzzy little head there that they hadn't seen before. They come over, and they go, who the hell are you? What are you doing here? And I opened my camera bag. Now, in those days, on the top of my camera bag, I had some of my equipment, which is a big bottle of Remy Martin cognac. And actually, on top of that, was my bottle of Cuervo tequila. These are some of my supplies at the time. So we opened up the tequila, and we started drinking. That was breakfast, and I started showing them a lot of the pictures I had with me. And then we started into the Remy. That was lunch. And by the time we got to where we were going, we were friends. You know? And I photographed them a lot. They were a great, great band. Amazing music. Yes? Jim Dandy? Jim what? Only briefly. I did take pictures of Black Oak, but it was just kind of an in and out assignment. I didn't really get to know them. Yes? Black Flag? I didn't take pictures of them. I happened to see them by accident in Miami one time. When I was driving down the street. I took my son to visit my in-laws, and when they all went to sleep, I was driving down the street, and I saw some punks hanging on the sidewalk. And I just made a U-turn, stopped, went in, and it turned out the Black Flag was playing there. Yes? Advice? Don't give up the day job. It's a lot of fun. It's a lot of work. Nowadays, with so many people taking pictures, there's even more competition than I was facing. So it's not easy to make a living doing it, but it is fun. I mean, if you get around and get to meet people.
What's that?
I'll say one bit of advice is if you go to the sound check, you have a much better chance of meeting the road manager or some people, connected with the band. And after you do take pictures of them, try to get back to that guy and show him your pictures. Yes?
I have a mic here if someone wants to. I'll go ahead and pass it around. Raise your hand, we'll bring you a mic.
What is your gnarliest punk rock photography story?
Oh, gnarliest. I don't know. There's a lot of them. A lot of drunken nights and CBGBs. And I don't know. I got on a plane one morning, 8 o'clock in the morning, to go to Radio Luxembourg with the Sex Pistols. And they started drinking on the plane. I think we were doing vodka and orange juice on the plane. And then for some reason, the DJ decided to take us to a bar before we went to the interview. So they had a few more drinks. And we got to Radio Luxembourg. We were in the lobby waiting for them to let us go upstairs. And I usually take pictures. I don't make arrangements like, we're going to meet 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Usually just when I'm with a band, if I see all 4 guys standing together, I say, okay, guys, look at me for a second. I'll take a quick picture. And I actually took the picture of the Sex Pistols with the straws in that bar in Luxembourg. But then we get to the radio station, and we're waiting to go up, and I was taking some pictures, and Steve dropped his pants. There's actually a funny picture you can see online. His underwear is kind of stained in an odd way. And the receptionist was so outraged that he dropped his pants that we almost got thrown out of the place before they even did the interview. Anyway, they let him do the interview and continuing drinking for most of the afternoon. So by the time we got back to the airport, we got through customs, but when we got to the plane people, the stewardess and the captain weren't going to let us on the plane. But the Belgians weren't going to let us back in the country. And so we were in the middle, and these people are arguing like, no, you're letting them on the plane. No, you're taking them back in the country. No, you're getting on the plane. In the end, we did get back on the plane. They promised to be good, and we got back to England. Not every band, but I do. Since high school, my friends have always been artists and musicians. So it's kind of natural for me. But it's not automatic. You become friends with people the way people, if you get along with people.
Hey, Bob, here's another question for you.
Yes.
How do you stay creative when shooting concerts when everybody else has the same first 3 songs and soundboard obstacles?
Well, I very much resent the 3-song limit because it just limits you so much. And at the beginning of a show, the artists are usually trying to get everybody's attention. They're running around. It's not until about the 5th song when they do the power ballad that they stop for a minute and they actually do a picture, a pose you can take a picture of. For myself, I would rather have the last 3 songs when all the lights are on and the confetti's flying and everybody's cheering instead of the first 3 songs. It was started for a very odd reason. And they started the 3-song rule in the 80s because some managers felt that they could control the merchandise if they could control the photos. For some reason, they felt that all these people taking pictures were somehow connected to the bootleg merchandise. No bootlegger has ever bought a picture from me or given me a royalty. But what they do is they try to control the image of the band by controlling the amount of pictures that people can take. But what I found about the competition, this is something I learned very early on, around 1971 or so, when I first started taking pictures of bands. There was only one other photographer doing rock and roll in New York at the time, and he was very jealous, and he actually was telling a couple of publicists not to hire me because they should hire him. And it was a bit of a competition for a few months until we realized that we were standing next to each other almost every night, and we were sending pictures to the same Cream magazine or the Village Voice or NME in England, and they were publishing both of us because we were taking different pictures. Because even if you're standing right next to somebody, you have a different lens and certainly a different timing, and you have different pictures. So I don't think about the other photographers. I try to think of them not as competition, but as colleagues. And it's easier that way, because we all can get published. Everybody takes different pictures.
Thank you. Here's another question for you.
Do you have any good stories about the city of Detroit and possibly with the MC5 or Iggy Pop and the Stooges?
I never actually saw Iggy or the Stooges in Detroit. When I went to Detroit the first time, I think, was with the New York Dolls. And I remember being there when Kiss opened for the New York Dolls, in fact. I loved the Detroit Palace, and people would get all dressed up, and the Dolls came out. The first time, everybody was dressed up. It was like the night to remember in Detroit, and the Dolls came out and hit the stage, and the sound system blew out in the first song. And they went off stage, and they tried to fix it, and they couldn't fix it, and they turned the monitors around. They ended up playing the rest of the show through the monitors. But I like Detroit. I went there a number of times because Cream magazine was located right nearby there. It's a very rock and roll town. I remember being out there with Alice Cooper. I think that it was near there where they had the first big, it was the first enclosed dome, some kind of Super Bowl arena that had a roof on it. And I went to the custom van show in the 70s. If you have any idea what that was, it's, they would, little, what do you call it, cars, a van, and they would deck them out inside like a little motel room with a stereo and a bed and what do they call it, shag rugs completely over the whole ceiling of walls. It was quite a funny show, but Detroit's a car city, so they liked that there.
More questions?
Yep.
All right, anybody have a question they'd like to take? All right, here we go.
Front.
Anything of Black Sabbath?
Black Sabbath. I met them very early on. There was a church in New York that was a disco called the Sanctuary. And they had their press party there because it was very gothic looking. And I had no idea who they were, and certainly no idea how big they were. But a lot of people like my pictures now because I think we did the press party, and then we actually took a walk through Central Park. In those days, nobody had any idea who they were. We could just walk around. There's a nice picture of them sitting in the grass. You couldn't do that today. And actually, I went to Russia with Ozzy, too. Well, actually, not just with Ozzy. I went there. It was called the Moscow Music Peace, and it was like an anti-drinking, anti-drug campaign that we went to Moscow. And Ozzy was definitely the star. They had Bon Jovi and Skid Row and all these other people. And all the Russians wanted to know, where is Ozzy? Must see Ozzy. They were all looking for him. Yes?
Hello?
Yep.
What's the worst experience you've had?
Oh, there's so many bad ones. I don't know which one are the worst. I don't make lists. A lot of times people ask me, what's the worst? What's the worst person you worked with? What's the best? What's my favorite? I actually have quite an exciting life, so I don't make lists. The one time they asked me to make a list of favorite albums, my top 10 went to 25 because I had one A and one B and one C and things like that. I don't know, maybe walking through 4 feet of snow to buy a roll of film when I was shooting Alice Cooper. We ran out of film. And that same guy, Chuck Pullen, that I was talking about earlier, both of us needed to get film, and it was like literally 4 or 5 feet of snow, a blizzard in Montreal, or Toronto, in Toronto. We had to walk from the studio about a half a mile through the snow to the shopping center to get film. That was pretty...
Hey, Bob, one question all the way here to the back.
Okay, where?
Over here.
Light here.
What was your favorite era of David Bowie to photograph? Because he was through so many different eras in his career. What was
All of
your
them.
favorite?
All of them. You see, that's the thing. I don't really make a favorite. Like this one was better than that one. Every time I saw David Bowie, he was amazing, and a perfect gentleman, and the most. You know, I guess since he was into mime or so on, he really knew how to move on stage. He was just so expressive, and he had the best costumes. I think it was Diamond Dogs tour, where he had kind of a scaffold, and like at one point he was in an outfit looking like Humphrey Bogart. The next minute he's in a skin-tight thing looking like a spaceman. He had a kind of a cherry picker built into the scenery, so he would come out of the stage on this little chair that, you know, kind of elevated him out over the audience, and he was singing into a little red phone when he's going, "Can you hear me, Major Tom? You know, here I am out in space." He was on this little cherry picker floating above the audience. But he was always good. I've seen him in clubs. I saw him in Radio City Music Hall. And I was lucky to get to meet him, and he actually knew, he knew who I was and so on. And he was always an absolute gentleman, perfect person. I actually got to spend a weekend with him by accident. One night, David Johansen and Serinda Fox used to come over to my house a lot, and we'd cook dinner together and so on, and then I would drive them home. And I went out to drive them home on a Friday night, and in the car, Serinda mentioned that she heard that David Bowie was at the record plant. And I had just been up there the week before because John Lennon had been working at the record plant. So she thought that I could get them in because I knew John was there, and I thought because I knew Serinda was friends with David, I thought that she was going to get us in because David was there. And we went to the record plant. It was funny because just as we were walking in, we realized that neither of us had any reason to be there. And John wasn't there actually that night. But as we got there, David Bowie was walking from, I guess, the restroom back into the studio, and he saw Serinda. He goes, "Oh, I'm so glad you're here. Why don't you guys come into the studio? We're about to do the first playback of the Young Americans album." And so we heard the playback in the studio, and then he said, "Come back to my house." There was a friend of his showed up with something that was going to be able to keep us awake for a while. And that was Friday night. And I think Saturday came by. He had a house, a brownstone in the 20s on the west side. And I remember the first floor was kind of a normal living room and dining room, and the second floor you go up, there was bedrooms. And then the floor above that was decked out like a Soho loft. It was just a big open air room with kind of a loft balcony overlooking it. And we were up on the loft balcony, and he had every kind of projector. He had a 16 millimeter film projector, a Sony videotape projector, a cassette video projector, 8 millimeter projector. And we were watching all these different movies. He was talking about wanting to make some films and getting into that. And I remember watching the Dali Buñuel film, Un Chien de Luz, which is a very surrealistic kind of film. And during that time, I remember down below in the loft area, there was a window, and a light came on behind the window for a little while and then went out. That was Saturday. And Sunday afternoon, when we finally left and I went home, and I hadn't been able to call my wife the whole weekend, so I didn't know what she was thinking. And when I got home, she wasn't worried, and I think that was part of the reason why 3 months later we broke up.
Hey, Bob, I know you can't see us, but we can see you all right. Here's another question all the way from the back.
Okay.
Is there any band or artist that you haven't shot that you would like to?
Well, actually, I always wanted to meet Otis Redding, and I'm really sorry I didn't get to meet him. When I was in Macon, I almost went to his farm to meet his widow, and we didn't even get to do that. But other than that, I've met pretty much everybody I've wanted to, and I'm still meeting people, and I'm still, getting new things done.
All right, Bob.
Hi, back here, can you see me?
No,
The other
where-
direction, to your left.
Anyway,
I have a
where are
question
you? Wait,
about,
Oh, in the middle there?
yeah,
Okay.
of Yoko and John. You said you took it shortly before they died. I know my who's here, we're military photographers. One of my biggest fears is the last I don't want it to be the last captured image. What was that like for you after you found out that he was dead?
It was about the worst thing I ever heard. I was in the darkroom developing the pictures I had taken 2 days earlier. I was late. I was supposed to be there that night. Because I had taken some pictures. I went to the studio on Thursday and told to show them some pictures because the Village Voice was going to be doing a story about them. And Yoko said, well, let's take some new ones. The album's doing really well. We should have a new set of pictures. So we took some Thursday night, and John had a new jacket. He said, come back tomorrow. I want you to take pictures of my new jacket. And we were up all night, and I remember Friday night sitting there all night. There was a glitch in the tape, and John and I sat on the floor for about 2 hours. He was very happy that the album was going up the charts so well. He was planning a tour. He was from a position of strength and understanding after having spent 5 years raising Sean. He really knew a lot about responsibility, about controlling his drug and alcohol intake, like none, about responsibility for his family. He had just grown up and become an adult, and he was doing interviews at that time expressing all of that. And if anybody wants to know about John Lennon, there's 2 interviews in particular, one with Andy Peebles from the BBC and one with David Sheff for the Playboy magazine, and both of those are published as books. And they really sum up his philosophy at the end of his life. And I went home with the greatest feeling that I was going to go around the world on tour with John Lennon, and I was going to meet the leaders of the world. And I just was so excited about it. And then Monday, I was developing the film, and I was developing it as usual late. I was supposed to go show them the pictures at the record plant and then get to the Village Voice by 2 o'clock in the morning. And it was 11, and I was almost done, but I was finishing up when my doorman buzzed me, and he said, do you have a radio or a TV on? I said, no, why? And he said, I heard John Lennon was shot. And then my phone rang, and a friend of mine, one of the people who had actually worked with at the very beginning with John Lennon, he called, and I remember he said, what's going on? I said, I have no idea. What have you heard? And he said that he just heard on the TV that John Lennon was dead. And dead is probably the worst 4-letter word in the English language. Because I just remember sinking to the floor and trying to think of how you can change it, how you can make it better, how you can fix it, and you can't fix something like that. And then this phone started ringing some more, and I realized that the whole world was watching, and I had to get the pictures out because my job was to help him look good in the newspapers. And so I got a bunch of pictures out right away. The New York Times and the New York Post both had my pictures on the cover. But it was a really bad week. I didn't sleep until probably the following Sunday. And still thinking about it, it's just pointless. And I just don't understand how somebody could do something like that and affect the whole world. And we certainly need voices like John Lennon's today. I think if he had stayed alive, we might not need his voice today.
Thank you, Bob. One question right here, front row in the middle here.
Okay.
Good evening. When you cease to exist on a physical plane, because I don't want to say how terrible it will be, how do you want to be remembered? What is your legacy to the world?
I haven't really thought much about that because that's for other people to... I've tried to share what I do with people as much as I can, and I think I'd like to be remembered for that, for sharing some of the excitement and some of the freedom that inspires me.
All right, Bob, all the way over here to your left.
Being a photographer, you do a lot of reflecting and looking back, and a lot of the stories that you just shared with us tonight, it's a lot of reflection. But that gives a really unique perspective, especially being down some of the roads that you've been down. If you had to tell some younger kids, some up-and-comers, like what they should focus on, looking at music as a career, as a venue, what would you tell them?
Good luck. I don't really know. You know, the world's very different from the one I was in. I didn't really choose this career the way people today, you know, seem to have career plans. My career plan was to turn on, tune in, and drop out. And I just happened to drop out with a rock and roll band that got a deal that I met the right people and ended up being a rock and roll photographer, but I didn't have a plan. So I don't know if I'm really the one to give advice to people who have plans. I kind of wake up in the morning and, you know, you go to sleep with some plans of what you think you're going to do the next day, and you get up in the morning and the phone rings, or nowadays you get an email and things change, and you just kind of make the best of it every day.
All right, Bob, one question, same spot here to your left.
Okay.
Well, I think I can speak for a lot of people here. Your photographs are very inspiring, so thank you for your lifelong work. And yeah. My question is, are you still photographing with film? And if so, what types of film are your favorites? And do you have a darkroom of your own?
I gave up my darkroom. We actually stopped developing film at home, but mostly because I had an assistant for 17 years who was my printer. And when she died, I just didn't have it in me to train somebody else to work. My darkroom was in the house without water. You had to get water from the bathroom. It was kind of an intimate situation. So we stopped printing at home. I'd still make silver gelatin prints. I have a printer who's French. He's an artist. And we make silver gelatin prints to sell in galleries. But I primarily shoot digital. It's just so much easier, and it's a digital world. You can't really send anybody a slide or a print for a magazine. You know, they all require scans nowadays. So if I were to shoot in film, I would have to scan it. So it's just easier to shoot with scans in the first place. I did, however, have a job. The job that I did this summer with the stripes for the Hysteric Glamour fashion company. They wanted me to do my old school style, and they wanted film. And I said, don't we have a button in Photoshop for that, you know? But they wanted me to do it like I used to do it. So I went and, went online to buy some film, and they don't make Ektachrome anymore or Kodachrome. So what I used to do doesn't exist. But I got some Fujichrome, because that does exist. And I had to find a place. Since we were shooting in London, I didn't want to bring the film through the X-ray twice. So I had to find a place in London where I could buy film and then a lab that would process it for me. The thing I really liked best about the experience was that the lab told me that on the way out of the developing machine, they can automatically scan every single frame. And they could deliver me a roll of slides and scans. Because I was thinking, like, you have to go through all the slides and edit it out and then make scans of a few dozen to send to the company. That's very time consuming to make scans. And once they're out of the machine, they get dust on them. You don't just push a button and get a scan. You have to push a button and then get a scan that you have to clean. You have to get all the dust off. You have to balance it. It takes a lot of time for each individual scan. Well, nowadays, when the film comes out of the processing machine, they make a scan. And I thought that was great. And it was actually a big enough scan. It's not a big, giant one, but it's big enough that certainly you can see it and edit with it. But it was big enough that I delivered the job with the scan that the lab gave me. The funny part was that I dropped off the film, and they said, okay, it'll be ready around 2 o'clock tomorrow. How are you going to pick up your scans? Are you going to bring a hard drive or a thumb drive? I was like, oh, I hadn't even thought about that. And they said, well, don't worry, we can put it on a WeTransfer link. And so they sent me an email that the film was ready with the link. I sent the link home to my assistant in New York, and by the time I picked up the slides in the lab, my pictures were already home in my server in New York. So that was kind of convenient.
All right, still staying here to your left, all the way to the side, to your left-hand side.
Okay.
First off, Bob, thank you very much for coming tonight, and thank you to the Mesa Music Festival for bringing you and Henry here for free.
Thank you.
Amazing. I got here a little late, so I apologize if you've covered this already, but I saw pictures online today that you took of Alice Cooper with Salvatore Dali.
Yes, I did talk.
I was wondering if you could just tell us what that was like.
Well, I talked a little bit about it. It was quite a day. Alice was wearing $2.5 million worth of diamonds. It was kind of funny because the diamonds arrived. They came up, 3 people. It was a little man with a bowler hat. He had the attaché case with the diamonds. There was a beautiful model with him, and this large thug with a machine gun, like the old-fashioned. This was in the 70s, so it looked like a Tommy gun kind of machine gun. And he stood by the elevator. Nobody went in or out until the diamonds, were back safely in his possession. The man with the bowler hat came over. He opened up the attaché case on the table, and he took out a velvet pillow, and he put the diamonds on the pillow and handed it to the model, and the model came over and presented them to Dolly, who put them on Alice. He wanted real diamonds because he wanted them to really shine in the hologram. And I do know that Dolly picked Alice because he felt that Alice was a surrealist as a performer, as Dolly was. The part about the Confucianism, I remember, because Dolly there was 2 other people from the press. I think there was a reporter from New York Times and from Time magazine. And at one point, Dolly started talking, and he started going on about Confucianism, that nothing is ever really understood, that nobody really knows anything, that the world is just a totally confusing place. And when he saw that I seemed to understand it, he started speaking in languages, like just crazy languages, and waving his arms, trying to confuse me, I guess. So it was really a fun day.
All right, sticking here to your far left-hand side, one more question.
Okay.
Hi, Bob. I have a question. I'm wondering, do you sell copies of your prints?
Oh, I'm glad you asked. Yes, I do sell copies of my print. Please send me an email through my website, bobgruen.com.
Thank you.
It's one of my favorite things to sell my pictures, yes.
Well, you'll be hearing from me soon.
Great, thank you. And also my books. I'm sorry we didn't have a book signing here today. We've been talking about it, but it didn't get organized in time. But all my books are available online. And again, if you want to contact me, and the easier way is if you buy it online and have them ship it to me, and then we can just charge you to ship it to wherever you are. I can sign them for you. Or just buy them online. They're good without the signature, same book. Or I can send you a card to put in the book or something.
All right, any other questions? Here we go, one more here to your left, or to your right far side.
Where?
Hi, Bob.
Okay, yes.
Real quick question. What was the photo session like for Kiss's Dress to Kill album?
Oh, that was fun. Cream magazine called me, and we talked about making what is called a photo novella, which is like a little comic book made out of photos. And Kiss came up with the idea that they were going to save the world. So they start off wearing suits. Even though they had their Kiss face, nobody would recognize them in their day clothes and wearing suits. They were supposed to be like average, secret identity. And they were going to work, and there's pictures of them in the subway reading the newspaper, and they see in the newspaper that there's going to be a concert. We cleverly disguised John Denver as John Cleveland. And they were outraged, and they thought that the world was going to be totally boring and that they had to, wake up the world. So they made a whole bunch of posters for a fake John Cleveland concert, and when everybody shows up, instead of John Cleveland, Kiss comes out and saves the world with rock and roll, and then they get medals pinned on their chest, and then they celebrate with an orgy afterwards. And it was all very spontaneous. Actually, Gene and Ace are wearing my suits because they didn't have suits at the time. Paul and Peter actually had their own suits. Gene is wearing my wife's clogs, which make him look even more like a monster. He's about 3 sizes bigger than me, so if you look at the picture, you'll see that the suit is way too small for him. And he even emphasized it by pulling up the sleeves, and he's wearing the clogs, so he looks like an animal. He looks like the Hulk busting out of the clothes. But it was really just very spontaneous. We were in the subway taking the pictures. We came up on the sidewalk. I said, hey, guys, by the way, it's 8th Avenue and 23rd Street for all the fans who like to go there. And we just took a couple of pictures on the sidewalk. There's actually a picture you can sometimes see online where there's a couple of guys standing to the right of them who are cracking up because they can't believe that these weirdos are standing on the sidewalk. And for the orgy picture at the end, I had no money for models or any planning like that. I went to a Kiss concert in Passaic, New Jersey, and I kind of watched the audience to see who was cheering the most. So at the end of the show, I went over to them and I said, do you want to come backstage and meet the band? I swear I can get you backstage and I'll bring you back into the show. I just want to take a picture together with the band. And about half of the girls agreed because we had to actually go out the front of the theater to get into the side door. And some of them balked. They didn't think that I could really get them back in because there was no direct backstage door. But about 4 or 5 of the girls came with me and we went to the room. I think Gene is actually with his real girlfriend in that picture, and Peter is with his wife in that picture. But it looks like an orgy. It looks like they're having a lot of fun. And for some reason, the title Kiss Orgy seems to get more hits on my website than any of the other pictures. So.
All right, Bob, we're coming right down front here to probably one of our youngest attendees here in the crowd today.
Hello.
Which band partied the hardest?
Which band partied the hardest? Well, they all did. It's hard to see which limit. It depends on the night. But I didn't get to travel with them, so I've heard a lot about Led Zeppelin, and certainly times on the Rolling Stone plane. But for me, I think drinking the most was with the Allman Brothers, actually, and the New York Dolls. The New York Dolls, we did a lot of all kinds of things. Anything they had. We'd try anything.
All right, any last questions? All right, we'll go 2 more questions, and then we'll let Bob finish up.
What's your favorite memory from CBGB's, and how would you describe the atmosphere of that place when it was really at its peak?
Oh, all my memories are favorites. CBGB's was fun. It was a kind of club that it was a place where bands learned how to play. You didn't really have to be good to play in CBGB's. Hilly Crystal, who was the owner of CBGB's, was different from other club owners in that he didn't really want to make a lot of money. He didn't only hire bands that could sell out the club. If you could bring every band could bring 4 or 5 friends who would buy beer. And Hilly just basically wanted to sell enough beer every night to pay the rent. He really didn't want to work a lot. It kind of backfired on him that the club got so successful. Because Hilly, it was kind of like if your parents go out of town and they leave your uncle in charge, but all he wants to do is have a beer and watch TV, and you kids can go in the basement and do whatever you want. But if you break something or get in a fight, he'd throw you out. And that's the way Hilly was. He let the kids go in the back and do whatever they wanted. And that's why a lot of bands learned, because he would let people like the Ramones were terrible. Blondie was not very good. Loads of those bands were not very good when they first played, but there weren't a lot of bands around, so they could play night after night. It's not like you had to wait 3 months for your people nowadays, they say, hey, can you come to my gig? I'm playing on February 21st, Back then it was like I'm playing next weekend and 2 weeks after that again. And also a big thing about it, there's 2 things. One was that the bands at CBGB's had to play original music. Now people think that that was a creative decision, that he wanted bands who could, write and were interesting. It was actually because music that's published, you have to pay royalties for ASCAP or BMI if music's been published. And you have to pay performance royalties. So anytime a band is playing music in a venue for money, they have to pay ASCAP or BMI. But Hilly's wife found out that if they were singing songs that weren't published, you didn't have to pay. So Hilly kind of insisted that they all had to write original music that hadn't been published, which was a big, boost, because almost every other club, you had to play cover songs, because that's club owners felt that's what the audience wanted, was things they were familiar with. But Hilly insisted that bands had to play new songs. That was one thing. And the other thing was that since it was a small scene, if Blondie was on stage, the audience was Patti Smith and the Ramones and New York Dolls and Richard Hell or whoever. Well, the next week Patti Smith was on stage, Blondie was in the audience with all the other people. And then the next week, another band. So you were basically playing in front of your friends. So when you got on stage, you had to have a new outfit, because everybody had just seen all the clothes you were wearing for the last couple of weeks. So it kind of encouraged people to do a little better, to do a little more, to have something new every time they got up there. And there were loads and loads of bands that are not the famous bands, like the Miamis, that everybody loved, who opened for everybody. And I like to say that the Miamis wrote 78 hit #1 singles that were never recorded, because they were a fantastic band. The Shirts, a band that I liked was called Steel Tips. They were an art group from New Jersey. It looked like a giant truck driver, and the singer was a girl with a Catholic schoolgirl's uniform. And CBGB's was open for over 35 years, 365 days a year. They were open Christmas and New Year's. They had 7 bands a night. So that's more than 30,000 bands. And 7 of them. You've heard about Talking Heads and Television and the Ramones and Blondie and Patti Smith and all the famous bands that came out of CBGB's. There's actually only about 7 or 8 famous bands. And there's 30,000 others. So it was always fun down there. It wasn't about being famous.